I wasn't looking for Dyatlov Pass when I found the map. I was researching something entirely mundane, pre-Soviet cartographic traditions of the northern Urals, the way indigenous Mansi hunters documented terrain for the benefit of people who would come after them. It's painstaking work. Most of what survives is fragmentary, held in regional archives that don't always communicate with each other, cataloged inconsistently, cross-referenced almost never. You spend a lot of time looking at documents that tell you nothing. And then occasionally you find something that tells you everything. The map is held in the Yekaterinburg Regional Archive. It dates to the late 17th century, a hunting and seasonal migration document produced by Mansi guides familiar with the eastern slope of the northern Urals. It is a practical document. Landmarks are noted, water sources, seasonal passes, dangerous terrain. Each notation corresponds to a symbol system that is, for the most part, straightforward to interpret. A circle with an interior line means water. A jagged bracket means rocky ground. The symbols are consistent, logical, the vocabulary of people who needed their maps to work, except for one symbol, a single marking appearing once at coordinates that anyone who has spent time with the Dyatlov case will recognize immediately: the exact location of Dyatlov Pass. The symbol has no legend entry. It appears nowhere else in the document. I spent 3 weeks trying to find a parallel in other Mansi cartographic records. I found 2 near matches, both partial, both in documents from different archives, both marking locations I will return to shortly. But in the original map, on the slope, the Mansi called by a name that translates most literally as the mountain that does not keep. There it was. A marking with no explanation, placed with the same careful precision as every other notation on the document, by a hand that clearly knew exactly what it was marking. That was when I stopped being able to look away. Let me tell you what we are officially told happened, because the official account is important, not because it's satisfying, it isn't, but because the gaps in it are the shape of something larger, and you can only see the gaps clearly if you first understand what the official account actually claims. February 1959. 9 experienced Soviet hikers, students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, set out to ski across the northern Urals. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, experienced beyond his age, meticulous in his preparation. The group had undertaken difficult winter expeditions before. This was a Category 3 route, the highest difficulty classification in the Soviet system, but these were not people who made careless decisions about mountains in winter. They knew exactly what they were doing. On the night of February 1st, they made camp on the eastern slope of a peak the Mansi called Sholat Shachel. In Russian, the name translates to Dead Mountain. The Soviets called it by that name too, apparently without curiosity about where the name came from or why the Mansi had given it. They never broke camp. When searchers found the tent weeks later, it had been cut open from the inside, not torn by wind, not collapsed by snow, cut deliberately with a knife from the interior by people in a significant hurry. The hikers had fled into minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures without boots, without adequate clothing, without equipment. The tracks in the snow showed they had walked, not run, at least initially, in a relatively organized fashion before the trail became confused and scattered. They were found across an area of roughly 1.5 miles. Some had made it to the tree line, others had not. 2 were found with branches in their hands, branches broken from heights, suggesting they had tried to climb trees. For what purpose, no one has ever satisfactorily explained. The deaths themselves divide into 2 categories, and that division is important. 5 of the 9 died of hypothermia, tragic, explicable, a function of fleeing into extreme cold without adequate clothing. The remaining 4 are different. Their injuries were catastrophic: broken ribs, a fractured skull. One hiker, Semyon Zolotarev, had a chest wound consistent with what the examining physician described as the result of a car crash, massive compressive force, with no external bruising. No external bruising. The force came from somewhere that left no mark on the skin, and Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, not damaged, not partially preserved, missing along with her eyes and parts of her facial tissue. The official explanation for this was offered and then quietly abandoned: post-mortem decomposition, water activity, small animals. The examining physician noted in a document that was not included in the published investigation that the tissue loss was inconsistent with natural decomposition in the environment where she was found. He noted it once. He was not asked to elaborate. The document was filed. For 25 years, the entire investigative record was classified, not the conclusions, the photographs. The official investigation concluded that the hikers had been killed by a compelling natural force. That phrase, compelling natural force, is the Soviet legal equivalent of "we do not know, and we are choosing not to find out." It appears in no other criminal investigation document of the era that researchers have been able to locate. It is a phrase that was apparently coined specifically for this case, to close it completely, and to close it in a way that discouraged follow-up questions. The case was shut. The mountain was quietly restricted. And for 25 years, the photographs slept in a classified archive in Moscow. When the files were partially released in the late 1980s, researchers found something. Not the photographs themselves, not all of them, but a reference in the inventory of classified materials to a roll of film developed from a camera found with one of the hikers. The film had been developed. The contents had been reviewed by investigators. The negatives were listed as transferred to Moscow for further review. They have not been publicly located since. What was on that film? The inventory listed only as anomalous content requiring additional assessment. No assessment was ever published. The negatives remain unaccounted for. We know they existed. We know investigators saw them and decided they needed to go somewhere else, somewhere further from the case file, somewhere further from Yekaterinburg, somewhere further from anyone who might ask questions. The silence around that film is its own form of answer. Now I want to return to the map and to the other symbols. I told you I found near matches to the Dyatlov Pass marking in two other Manzi cartographic documents. I need to be precise about what I mean by near matches, because precision matters here. The symbol at Dyatlov Pass is distinctive but not unique. It appears to follow a visual grammar, a construction logic, that suggests it belongs to a category of marking with shared meaning, even if that meaning was never formally recorded. The first near match appears in a hunting document held in the Tobolsk archive, undated but assessed by archivists as early 18th century. The location it marks is in the northern Urals, roughly 200 kilometers from Dyatlov Pass. In 1943, a Soviet military installation was constructed at those coordinates. Its purpose was listed in regional records as signals research. It was demolished in 1957, 2 years before the Dyatlov incident. The demolition records describe it as decommissioned due to site instability. No further detail. The land was designated a restricted zone. It remains restricted. The second near match appears in a navigation document from the Perm archive, dated more confidently to the 1680s. The location it marks sits near the eastern Ural watershed. In 1951, the Soviet government initiated a reservoir project in that region. Construction was completed in what regional engineering records describe as an accelerated timeline. 18 months for a project that comparable Soviet infrastructure works of the period required 4 to 6 years to complete. The reservoir flooded 12,000 hectares of land, including the coordinates marked on the 1680s map. The project was given a priority classification that, researchers have noted, was typically reserved for military construction, not civilian water management. Whatever was at those coordinates is now under 40 meters of water. The third location, the third mark in this pattern, does not require archival research to locate. It is visible on current satellite imagery. A closed military installation in the northern Urals, active to this day. Its stated purpose listed in the public registry as meteorological monitoring. It sits at coordinates that align with a precision I am not prepared to call coincidental with a third partial symbol variant I found in a Mansi document in Yekaterinburg, in the same archive that holds the original map, in a folder cataloged 2 years after the Dyatlov investigation was closed. Someone placed that document in that archive after 1961. Someone who had access to both the investigative materials and the archival collection. Someone who knew what the symbol meant. The pattern is this. Pre-Soviet Mansi cartographers, people who mapped terrain for practical survival purposes, marked these locations with a symbol that appears nowhere in their standard notational vocabulary. The Soviets built at 2 of them and demolished or buried both. The third they built at and kept. And the fourth, the one at Dyatlov Pass, they left alone. Or rather, they left what was there alone. What they removed were 9 people and a roll of film. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unfocus your eyes from it. I want to be careful here. I want to be careful because the instinct, when you are sitting with evidence like this, is to reach for the largest possible explanation, the most totalizing account. To say, here is what happened, here is what they found, here is what was on that film. But the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence supports something more uncomfortable. It supports the idea that there is a shape here, a distribution of locations and events and institutional responses, and that shape is not random, but I cannot see its face. What I can see is this. The hikers left their tent in an organized fashion. They walked downhill. They made decisions that have been interpreted as panicked and irrational, but which in context might look different. They walked away from the tent rather than toward it, yes, but they walked together initially. They maintained enough presence of mind to try to build a fire. They maintained enough presence of mind, apparently, for at least one of them to continue taking photographs. What if they were not fleeing in panic? What if they were leaving deliberately? What if the cut in the tent was not the evidence of terror, but of decision? A group of people who had seen or found or stumbled into something, who had made a collective choice to get away from it as quickly as possible, who had understood that what they were near was something that required immediate distance. They were on the eastern slope of a mountain the Mansi had been marking with a warning for 300 years. They were experienced enough to know that mountain, experienced enough to have planned their route carefully, to have documented it meticulously in the journal entries that survive. And then, at some point on the night of February 1st, something changed their priorities entirely. Not the weather. The weather that night was cold, but not exceptional for the region and season. Not an avalanche. The tent was not buried. The slope angle has been measured repeatedly and falls consistently below the threshold for natural avalanche initiation. Not a military test. The infrasound theory, the idea that Soviet rocket tests nearby generated low-frequency sound waves capable of inducing panic, has been examined seriously by researchers. It explains the flight. It does not explain the internal injuries. It does not explain the missing tongue. It does not explain why investigators decided the photographs needed to go to Moscow. What it does not explain is always where the real question lives. In 2019, 60 years after the deaths, Russian prosecutors reopened the Dyatlov case. They announced a renewed investigation, fresh analysis, modern forensic techniques applied to surviving evidence. They concluded, after 2 years of work, that the cause of death was an avalanche. They closed the case again. The 2019 reinvestigation was welcomed by many as a serious attempt at closure, and perhaps it was. But here is what I noticed about its timing. In March of 2019, a researcher at the Yekaterinburg Regional Archive submitted a formal access request for the complete Mansi cartographic collection held there. The collection includes the map I described at the beginning of this account. Her request cited academic research into pre-Soviet indigenous mapping traditions. Her request was denied in May of 2019. The denial cited a reclassification of materials in the collection, a reclassification that had occurred in February of 2019. The same month the reinvestigation was announced. The collection, including the original map, was reclassified from public archival access to restricted historical material status. The reclassification was processed through the Federal Archival Agency. The reason given was cultural heritage preservation, a designation that restricts physical handling but does not typically prevent scholarly review. The researcher appealed. Her appeal was denied in August of 2019 on the grounds that the materials had been identified as requiring specialist assessment before access could be granted. No specialist assessment has been published. Access has not been restored. The case is closed. The mountain is restricted. The photographs are in Moscow somewhere. The map is reclassified. And the symbol, the marking that 3 centuries of Mansi cartographers placed on that slope, sits in a folder in Yekaterinburg that you cannot currently look at. The silence, when you start listening for it, is everywhere in this story. I keep returning to the Mansi name, Kholat Shakal, the mountain that does not keep, not the dead mountain, not the dangerous mountain, not the forbidden mountain, the mountain that does not keep. In the Mansi language, the verb used is one that applies specifically to the relationship between a container and its contents, a vessel that does not keep, a boundary that does not hold, a place where whatever is placed inside it or whatever comes to it does not remain. They had a word for what happened there. They had been marking it on maps for 300 years. They encoded it in the name of the mountain itself, not to warn people away. That would have required a different word, a different construction, but to describe a quality, a characteristic, a property of that place. Things do not remain there. 9 people went up. 9 people did not come back down, not as they were. A film was developed in Sverdlovsk, and the negatives traveled to Moscow and did not return. A researcher asked to see a map, and the map traveled into restricted status and did not return. Whatever the Soviets built at the other marked sites, they demolished or drowned, and the purpose of those sites did not remain in the public record. The mountain does not keep. I don't know what the hikers found. I cannot tell you what was on that film. I cannot fully explain the internal injuries or the missing tongue or the precise mechanism by which 4 experienced adults came to have the kind of soft tissue and skeletal damage that the examining physician compared to a high-speed vehicle collision. What I can tell you is that a 17th century Mansi cartographer knew that slope was worth marking with a symbol that sat outside the normal vocabulary of their mapping tradition. That the Soviet state knew enough about at least 2 other marked locations to build at them and then to make them disappear. That 9 people with cameras went up a mountain one February, and the photographs they took were considered sensitive enough to be removed from the investigative record and transported to Moscow. And that 60 years later, when a researcher tried to look at an old map, the map moved beyond reach within the same month that a reinvestigation was announced to explain everything away. The pattern does not resolve into a single clear image, but it has a shape, and the shape is not random. What were the Mansi marking? What did the Soviet military find at those sites, find important enough to build and then urgent enough to destroy? What did 9 hikers see on the night of February 1st, 1959, that made leaving the tent in -30 degrees without boots feel like the only rational option? What is on that film? The mountain does not keep, but it remembers. And somewhere in the gap between what the Mansi knew 3 centuries ago and what investigators decided in 1959 needed to go to Moscow, the answer is still there, on a slope that the official record says contains nothing. In an archive that was quietly locked in the same month someone tried to look in a set of photographs that were developed and reviewed and then moved somewhere no one is currently allowed to look. Once you see the shape of it, you cannot unfocus your eyes. The mountain is still restricted, the case is still closed, the map is still reclassified. And we are still not supposed to ask why.